The Australian Financial Review.
A year ago, Labor won the federal election in a landslide.
Labor's election victory was so emphatic.
Anthony Albanese emerges from the contest as an enhanced Prime Minister.
This is an historic Labor moment.
But since then, everything has changed.
Good evening. We have breaking news of a major situation unfolding at Bondi Beach this evening.
One Nation continues to surge ahead in the polls.
War with Iran is entering a dangerous new phase.
Financial Review political editor Phillip Coorey spoke with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to mark the anniversary.
I guess I just want to start with, a lot's happened in a year politically.
He asked him about the rise of One Nation, the impact of the Iran war on the economy, and what will be the focus in next week's federal budget.
The needs of younger generations weren't given the proper focus that it should, and if you're about creating a better future, then those needs have to be looked after, that sense of opportunity.
While the Prime Minister was keen to focus on the young, Coorey says there is one generation that's set to miss out.
It's the Gen Xers who are overlooked here. Their opportunities to retire are hamstrung because they have to look after their kids who can't afford to get a start. And they're also dealing with ageing parents. I think it's the anti-Gen X budget. I actually do.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Phillip Coorey on the first year of Anthony Albanese's second term. What's going to happen with property taxes and why the biggest loser in this federal budget will be Gen X. It's Thursday, May 7. Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Pleasure, Lisa.
Phil, Sunday marked a year on from Labor's landslide election win, and to mark that, you interviewed Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. What did he have to say about the first year of his second term?
Look, it was a sort of a bit of a round-the-world interview, Lisa, but while I was talking to him, the Prime Minister was on the plane on the way back from Perth. He'd done a quick visit to Perth during the week, and he was in a reasonably good mood because he'd had a good reception over there. He was happy to sort of talk freely about everything. Clearly, the last year, I guess you could divide it into two bits. There's the stuff the government said they would do when they won the election. They immediately badged their first 12 months as the year of delivery, and aided by the easiest Senate any government's had in over 20 years. It was a doddle in terms of just legislating their entire agenda of promises they took to the election, which was largely about giving away money and cost of living measures predominantly. And then the other half of the year was the stuff they hadn't planned for, and that was obviously the Bondi Beach terrorist attack, and that had a significant impact on both the standing of the government and the Prime Minister. And then more recently, the war in Iran, the war against Iran, which has really upended budget preparations. So then if we look forward, which was probably what more the interview was about, because we're now 2 years to the next election, God help us, was about where to from here. I guess he was just laying the groundwork. He said we're now going from the year of delivery to the year of resilience.
The year of resilience, where we build for the long term.
And resilience is a very broad term. It can mean anything, and I think it will.
Resilience is about making more things in Australia.
And it's everything from making sure that the supply chain difficulties that have been once again exposed, this time by the war against Iran,
leaving us less vulnerable to international shocks.
Supply of petrol, critical minerals, which the government's been talking about for ages.
Being more in control of our own destiny. But it's also about giving people a stake in the economy, making sure that they know that they have opportunity, not that they're being left behind.
The Future Made in Australia agenda from the first term, that was a hangover from COVID, where there are just some things we have to do here now that may contravene the free market, but unless the government subsidises manufacturing of critical things, then we'll get caught short again in a crisis. So that was resilience, and then now he's extrapolating the definition of resilience to things like making sure society doesn't fall apart.
Building our resilience is about protecting ourselves from the economic division and social dislocation we have seen take hold in other parts of the world.
And in this case, he's talking about social cohesion being threatened by the growing intergenerational inequality over housing unaffordability.
If you look at some of the social unrest and divisions that are occurring in the industrialised world. You need to focus on that.
He's using that again as justification for the property tax increases we're going to see in the budget. He revisits his theory that he's not focusing now on winning the election now or trying to win it this week or next month, but he envisages, where you want to be when you call the election and works backwards from them. So it was really just his sort of philosophy about how they're going to sort of muddle their way through the next 2 years and set themselves up.
And you mentioned the things that he can't control. A couple of those factored into the poll that just came out this week. So run us through those numbers and how the government's looking.
Yeah, so look, we did as we do every month with the AFR, we do a poll in association with the Redbridge Group and Accent Research. And the difference between this poll and last month's poll was not very much, but the difference between this month's poll and a year ago, there's quite a lot has happened.
A separate news poll last week put One Nation's primary vote even higher.
Yeah, you've had the rise of One Nation,
surpassing the coalition for the first time.
I said earlier how the Liberal Party had sort of fallen off a cliff. Well, that's come at the expense of the rise of One Nation or vice versa. They got a 6.4% on election day a year ago. They're now at 27 in their latest poll. And they've been, Lisa, between 26 and 29 now for about 4 months. And a lot of this sort of happened on the back of Bondi. So One Nation got to about 17 or 18% by December last year. And we all thought they'd sort of plateaued then, and then Bondi came along and created all those tensions around immigration and everything else, and they jumped another 10 points since. So that's where they are in terms of Albanese's challenge. The thing that's really sort of affected the government in the last few months has been a real collapse in the Prime Minister's approval ratings. And when we say net approval, that's your approval rating minus your disapproval rating. And he was doing very well for a Prime Minister. In December, he was sitting at +1, and then within 3 months, on the back of Bondi, he went to -17. So that's a free fall. That's a really big plunge in approval rating. But then in the last poll we just did, he cut that back by 8 points. He went back to -9. So the consensus is that their handling of the Middle East war, with the way they've moved quickly to shore up petrol supplies, stop the price blowouts, cut the excise and stuff, he's been largely credited by the population as doing a good job. And there's still a sense that people are blaming Donald Trump for it overwhelmingly. The poll found 60% thought petrol prices was Trump's fault.
Phil, we have the federal budget coming up next Tuesday, and the government has really been pushing intergenerational equity as a key theme. The focus will be on housing affordability, and there's lots of speculation about how they might address that. Run us through their plans. What do you think is going to come out of this budget to address this key issue?
We don't know the final details, so I'm always a bit cautious because there may be something in the budget, and there usually is, that's something we don't know about. But we now know they're going after housing.
The government's set to overhaul the property tax breaks.
They're going after property taxes.
The 50% capital gains tax discount to be reworked.
Capital gain tax, take it to the bank. They're going to get rid of the 50% discount that John Howard introduced in 1999 and revert to the Keating-era model where the discount on a capital gain is based on inflation over the life of the asset, where you can deduct inflation from the capital gain, the cumulative inflation. But what's tricky is what we think they're going to do. They're not going to fully grandfather existing assets. So if you've got an asset now that you bought sometime between 1999 and now, it's going to be only partially grandfathered. They're going to look at a way of getting their sort of fingers into existing assets. That is going to be controversial. Negative gearing capital gains tax look almost certain, with some element of retrospectivity. And trusts, the Treasury's been hammering the government to go after trusts. Labor last tried to do trusts in 2019, lifting the minimum tax rate on disbursements from a trust to 30%. That is in the mix, but we're not definite on that yet. Now, I think we've got to be honest here, Lisa. As I'm speaking to you, the Treasurer just a few hours ago again made the case about intergenerational inequality.
There are issues, intergenerational issues in housing, in the tax system.
How it needs to be addressed.
We are concerned about how hard it is for people, particularly young people, to get a toehold in the market.
And that's all well and good, but that case could have been made 18 months ago, could have been made 2 years ago. I think we've got to call the government out here on dishonesty if they do it. They went to the last election well, not mentioning most of this, but actually promising not to do some of it, like negative gearing.
Why didn't the government take some of these proposed changes to the election last year?
Well, we made it clear.
Given the way we took the flamethrower collectively to Tony Abbott in 2014 when he announced a bunch of broken promises in his first budget, I think, it's incumbent on the rest of us to be a bit more critical on the government, the way they're sneaking a lot of this stuff through. And they'll be relying on the fact that these measures will be popular because it's a recognition now that millennials are fast becoming the majority of voters and they won't care, whether it's a broken promise as long as it's sticking it to the older generations. Now, we saw this in the first term when the Albanese government had two sizable broken promises. One was to redistribute the Stage 3 tax cuts towards lower and middle income earners, and the other one was to break the promise that there'd be no new taxes on superannuation. Now, in both cases, they got away with it because there's a resentment in Australia to people who have wealth, even if it's only modest. And I think they're going to rely on the same resentment in this budget to say too bad, to people who've got investment properties. The Prime Minister last week started talking about the intergenerational inequity.
The needs of younger generations weren't given the proper focus that it should.
And how that is now one of the forces tearing at social cohesion.
If you're about creating a better future, then those needs have to be looked after.
But the test will be, do they rebalance the ledger? Because just sort of hoiking into someone's negatively geared house or their capital gains benefit, that doesn't benefit someone who's trying to buy a house unless you're giving some of that to them. So unless you return it as an income tax cut, it's really just a tax grab.
So, Phil, I just want to drill down into those two things that we really think are going to happen, and those are changes to capital gains tax and changes to negative gearing. So with capital gains tax, right now, if you sell your house, you have to pay tax on the capital gain, but you're eligible for a 50% discount on the tax you pay. What the government is looking at, according to the speculation and according to what sources are telling you, is they'll scrap that system and, as you said, revert to the Keating-era model of an inflation-based discount that will apply to all asset classes, we think, including property and shares. So how would this work, and who do you think are going to be better or worse off?
It's a bit of a swings and roundabouts with the old index model, the inflation model. Sometimes you can be worse off, sometimes you can be better off. So the reason Howard brought in the 50% model was just for simplicity. So, for example, if I buy a house for $1 million, and this applies to assets that have to be held for 12 months, right? So let's say I buy a house for $1 million and I sell it in just over 12 months for $1.1 million. So the capital gain is $100,000. I only have to pay tax on $50,000 based on my tax rate, the tax I pay on the rest of my income. If, for example, Lisa, going back to the old system, if inflation was 5%, then you get to deduct 5% off the capital asset. So you're still only paying tax on $50,000 of the $100,000 capital gain, because 5% of $1 million is $50,000. So in that case, there's no difference between the two systems. But generally over time, the 50% is more generous and the government will make more money. And what they hope to do is get rid of sort of property flippers out of the market, people who come to an auction, go against some young couple trying to buy their first home, just outbid them because they know they're going to make 50% on the capital gain, if they turn the property over really quickly. The thing that's getting really tricky now is the grandfathering provisions.
Yeah, so that's what everyone's looking out for.
Yeah, and like when Labor went to the 2016 and 2019 elections promising to scale back capital gains and negatively gearing concessions, they said any assets that exist before the change comes into effect would be exempt, and that's only fair. It was pretty dirty pull to retrospectively tax something under a new agenda, but it looks like they're going to go there this time. So, for example, if I have a house that I've owned or an asset I've owned for 10 years and then the change comes to effect, the capital gain I have made on that asset up until the change will be taxed at 50%, and then the new system will come into effect. Any capital gains after that will be taxed under the new regime. Now, the problem with doing that, Lisa, is that everyone would have to rush out in the weeks after the budget and get their assets revalued.
Yes, yeah.
You're not just talking about $2.5 million investment properties, shared portfolios, art collections, whatever, right? And that would not just be pandemonium, but you could get someone to give you a really high value on your asset.
So you get the more generous tax treatment on the bigger part of the gain.
Yeah. So what we think they're going to do, and again, please don't make an investment decision based on this because it's just well-aimed speculation based on the odd nod and the wink, is that when you do sell the asset finally, let's say you've had a house for 10 years now and you sell it in another 5 years, then they'll take the capital gain at the end of that 15 years and 2/3 of it, which is the first 10 years, will be capital gain be taxed on the 50% model and the other third will be taxed on the inflation model, but it'll just be averaged out. So that will hurt people. Say someone bought a house 5 years ago, right? And house prices have gone nuts in the last 5 years. So you've made a huge capital gain, then say the house market flattens out and you don't make so much of a capital gain over the next 5 years. Those people will be worse off. But the idea here is to make money. The idea is that people who already have assets aren't protected from the changes. So it's a way of them getting their fingers into people's existing portfolios and property investments and stuff like that. Yeah, the optics of it will be very much pitched against boomers. I think one segment of society will regard it as quite unfair.
Just on that, Phil, the government never actually ruled out changes to capital gains tax, but they did say there would be no changes to negative gearing. So are they looking at breaking that promise?
Oh, 100%. They're so good at politics. The government is so very polished at politics. I've written a couple of times, Lisa, that sometime during the last term of government, there was a discussion, I think, around the cabinet table. Someone said no one should rule out capital gains tax because we want to do it next term. So if you go through all the transcripts of everything they all said last term, you won't find anywhere where they say, we're not touching capital gains tax. But with negatively gearing, it was more emphatic. I interviewed the Prime Minister during the election campaign. I pushed him quite hard on this. He basically said no, it would be anti-aspirational. He actually thought if you went after negative gearing, you could actually harm rental supply. So he made that argument. So, we wrote a story, PM rules out negative gearing changes. Now we didn't get a complaint from him or his office when that story went live. Now, again, I just caution, they may not have made the final decision on negative gearing yet. That was to be done this week. But if there is something on negative gearing in the budget, then that's pretty much that's your garden variety broken promise. When I interviewed the Prime Minister on the weekend, the anniversary, I asked him about it and he said,
deal with what's in front of you.
You deal with what's in front of you.
And just explain how negative gearing works and who that might affect the most.
The idea is your rent doesn't cover all your expenses, which include interest payments, rates,
maintenance,
upkeep, maintenance, government taxes, that sort of stuff, land taxes and stuff. And so you claim the losses as a tax deduction. It's not a rich person's sport either. I think about 93% of negatively geared homes, people only have one of them. And it's quite a sort of middle-class investment pursuit. So I think one of the problems here, Lisa, is the reason people go for things like this is because income in this country is taxed at such an exorbitant rate.
Yeah.
When you're paying 50 cents in the dollar, you can't sort of blame people for trying to find ways to keep their money. As the government says, keep more of the money they earn, rather than giving 50% to the tax man. The other way around, this is to lower tax rates.
Yeah.
Remove the incentive to use these sorts of other vehicles.
Yeah.
But there's no chance of that happening.
It's interesting that since 2019, when Bill Shorten was opposition leader and they took this to the government and he had the shock election loss, since then they've been so reluctant to do anything on negative gearing and capital gains tax. Why do you think they're more confident now?
Well, Albanese said at the time, after the 2019 defeat, when he took over his leadership, these are the things you've got to do from government, not from opposition. Now, look, in Labor's defence, back in 2015, Chris Bowen, as Shadow Treasurer, made a very solid case on negatively gearing capital gains tax, and they weren't punished at the subsequent election. They nearly won that election. By 2019, however, Lisa, there was a downturn in the market and Labor just promised too many taxes going into that election, so they were just prone to a scare campaign on so many fronts. So Albanese said afterwards, well, these are the sorts of things you do from government. Now, even though he did say that, they have not mentioned them since. They did not make a case for it before the election. In their own sort of minds and in the research they conduct, the public mood has changed, because housing is now the number one crisis in this country, without a doubt. And it's not something that just angers and frustrates younger people, but also their parents. I've got a kid who's 18 and a kid who's 16, and there's no way I can retire because my kids will never be able to leave home, and I'm a Gen Xer. So this is not exclusive to young people. This is across the board in terms of the sheer sense of hopelessness now that younger people face and the inability of their parents to, A, help them and B, retire as well. So it's a societal-wide problem. So the whole vibe has changed. Housing ceased at some stage becoming a basic right, an affordable right, and became an investment vehicle. And that was largely, it was the combination of capital gains tax and negative gearing which caused that. The other main problem too is immigration. Just so many people coming into the country and the inability to keep up supply. So again, you've got to be careful just singling out the tax treatment of housing. It wasn't a problem when migration levels weren't as high either. So the political climate is a lot easier now, Lisa, than it was in 2019. It's virtually unrecognisable. And I go back to my point about the Senate. Mm-hmm. There's going to be no political resistance. This will be announced on budget night. They could pass it in budget week if they wanted.
Yeah. So then is this federal budget going after the boomers?
Look, the Prime Minister says he's not. I did laugh. I did ask him this question in the interview, and he said, no, we're looking after older people too. And he listed the aged care reforms that they announced a couple of weeks ago about the changes, where you can means test your in-home care now, and the stuff Mark Butler announced 2 weeks ago where they were going to chop your private health insurance rebate if you're over 65 to pay for 5,000 extra home care beds. Mm. And I remember, budget after budget after budget, especially during the Howard years, was always aimed at senior Australians because they were the biggest voting demographic. Mm-hmm. They were critical to keeping the Howard government in power. I remember the 2001, we called it the Golden Oldies budget because Howard was in all sorts of trouble. He'd been deserted by pensioners and older people, retirees, because of the GST. He was in all sorts. And it was the most egregious set of bribes I've ever seen in my life. I think you got $300 for being over 60. It was called the thanks for everything you've done for the country payment or something equally as inane as that. So, yeah, there was a time where it was good to be of a certain age, but of course, as we Gen Xers were warned, the well's going to be dry when you get there, and they weren't wrong. I think it's the anti-Gen X budget. I actually do. I think most boomers are settled and they're on their way and they're retired. It's the Gen Xers who are overlooked here, the people born from 66, 65 onwards, who sort of didn't get the best of everything the boomers have, but are now having to pay all that. Like, as I said before, their opportunities to retire are hamstrung because they have to look after their kids who can't afford to get a start. And they're also dealing with ageing parents. If you were to sort of break it down, I think it's actually the Gen Xers who get it in the neck more than anyone in this budget. All the things we've been talking about so far, Lisa, the government's had planned for ages, but what has really thrown them off is Donald Trump's war against Iran. It has thrown all the budget processes into chaos in terms of revenue coming in, revenue going out, and because they have no idea when this thing is going to end and how it's going to end, it's put everything into a fizz.
We're talking about the Albanese government a year on from its landslide election win and less than a week out from what will be a very closely watched federal budget. Phil, how has the war in Iran complicated Labor's plans?
Well, the war has, as we said, Lisa, hasn't sort of thrown them off course in terms of going after all the property taxes and stuff. In terms of how much they've got to spend, how much they're trying to save. Yeah, don't forget, we've still got this massive debt. And when we're talking about intergenerational inequality, there's nothing worse than handing the next generation $1 trillion debt. And it doesn't feel like there's going to be much of a dent made in that. The trouble is with the war against Iran and the ham-fisted nature of its prosecution. Trump said it'll be over in 6 weeks. What are we, 2 months in, and we still don't know. And even if he ends it today, it will be months before things return to any semblance of normal. So if you look at up front, they've already had to find $2.5 billion just to cut fuel excise. So that's $2.5 billion they weren't planning on spending 2 months ago. They will make a lot more money out of the inflation problem. So it's important to remember that this economy was in no shape to cope with a shock before this war started. This economy looked like an economy that had been through a shock, not one bracing for one. The government had lost control of inflation. It was back to 3.7%. There was deficits forecast for at least a decade and debt going towards $1 trillion. That was our starting point, right? So what became already an unmanageable problem has now become worse. But one of the impacts of inflation is the government tends to make a lot more revenue through things like bracket creep and through commodity prices and so forth. At the same time, their expenses go up because, say, for example, the age pension, one of the biggest cost items in the budget, that and all the other welfare payments gets indexed to inflation twice a year. So, when inflation starts going up again, you got to find a lot more money just to pay for the annual indexations. But on balance, they tend to make more than they have to hand out.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is, Lisa, it makes the inflation challenge harder to get under control. And as for now, as per the poll we released this week, no one is yet blaming the government for this. The anger, if there is any, is still squarely at Trump and probably the Iranians and the Israelis and everyone else. But that would not be the case, I think, if this lingers for another 6 months to 12 months. People might turn on the government, and the government is aware of that. The other thing too, as Chalmers said, this is not the budget they were planning on delivering in February.
Today, I am also announcing that the federal budget next week will include an Australian fuel security and resilience package.
There will be several $1 billion on the fuel reserve strategy
to ensure at least 50 days of fuel supply and storage of diesel and aviation fuel.
So when this started, we were sort of caught short because we only had about 33 days of petrol and diesel and I think even less of jet fuel. And the International Energy Agency's standard, of which we're meant to adhere to, is 90 days. And that issue's been well ventilated over the last couple of months. But the government's done a really good job. Like, they've got petrol up to 46 days now. They've actually gone from 39 to 46 just in petrol alone.
Okay. And managing the fuel crisis with Albanese travelling the world trying to secure supply, it's perceived that that is not the best time to introduce a tax on gas exports, even though there's been a mounting campaign for that to happen.
100%, Lisa. So one of the big stories last week was the Prime Minister in Perth essentially announcing something that wouldn't be in the budget, and that would be an extra export tax on gas.
We want a fair return from the export of our gas. That is not a radical idea. Here is a proposal that is backed by the ACTU, backed by, a huge majority of Australians.
Now, there's a really strong consensus building on this across the political spectrum.
This is not a left versus right issue. You've got Clive Palmer and the Greens saying a 25% gas export tax is the way to go now.
Yeah, the Australian Institute, which is a left-wing think tank, to Clive Palmer, to Matt Coman, the CEO of the Commonwealth Bank, all the independents, the Teals, a lot of members of the Labor backbench. It's just built on the premise that just people don't feel we're getting a fair shake out of our gas.
Because Australians know that we're getting absolutely fleeced when it comes to our gas exports.
The Prime Minister he sort of said, they pay $22 billion a year in company tax, and it's sort of getting more from the exports. It's just this feeling that they essentially get the product for nothing, and the gas companies argue will cost many billions of dollars to be able to access that product for nothing by building gas wells. But I suspect the government probably would have moved on this, but because of the crisis, as the Prime Minister's finally said public last week.
Regardless of any debates that are taking place here, we honour contracts.
We're basically going cap in hand to the Malays, the Singaporeans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, whose Prime Minister was here this week. He went to Brunei. Now, we're dependent on these countries for diesel, for fertiliser, for oil to refine and for petrol. And we have these import contracts with them. We sell them gas. They sell us fuel. It's tempting now. If you can imagine if you're one of those countries, you want to put export controls on that to look after your own population. So the Prime Minister has been seeking assurances, publicly and privately, that they wouldn't do that and Australia would, quote, remain at the front of the queue. And he reasons the last thing you want to do in that environment is go and whack a tax on gas. You could call it craven or you could call it just good politics, because as someone in government to me said to me, it wasn't the Prime Minister, can you imagine if we did that? And then the Koreans said, we're not sending you any more diesel. Our trucking network and the farming network comes to a grinding halt. The government would rather the political blowback from not doing a gas tax than that. I wouldn't rule it out in the future.
So no tax on gas exports, changes to CGT, and Phil, the budget will also include the government's overhaul of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That's the big one, isn't it?
The big one, I think probably the most significant move. They finally got serious about the NDIS, and that was all announced 2 weeks ago by the Health Minister, Mark Butler. That will be written up on Budget Day as a saving to the budget of $22 billion, but they're going to go for 35, so there'll be a $13 billion estimate variation. That is not insignificant, both in terms of budget sustainability, but also engendering goodwill amongst the electorate to start increasing taxes, because you could not be serious about raising taxes on people while letting the NDIS just run madly like it is in terms of all the waste and fraud. We've blown so many taxpayer dollars on the waste and fraud inside the NDIS that it would be unconscionable, I think, to start raising taxes while not cracking down on where it's being wasted. So that was an important measure. But, there's always a surprise on budget day. I'm not going to say we know everything that's in it.
That's right. There's always a surprise for the press gallery. But it won't all be about the budget this weekend. The rise of One Nation will be a focus as we have the Farrer by-election. One Nation's candidate is the front runner. Labor's not running. But how closely is the government watching this one?
Oh, very. Not as close as probably as if they were in it. But the expectation is that Farrer, which is the seat that was held by Susan Lee, it's been a Liberal and national seat since it was founded in the 1940s. Tim Fisher held it for a long time, and then when Tim retired, Susan Lee won it in 2001 and held it right up until she retired. And now, as a sign of how much has changed, it would now be deemed a miracle if either the Liberals or the Nationals even came close to winning it on Saturday. That's how much they've atrophied out there. It'll be a contest between One Nation and the independent Michelle Millthorpe. If they win, if One Nation wins, then it will be the first seat they've actually won in federal parliament under their own steam. Barnaby Joyce holds New England, but he's a defector, and of course Pauline Hanson won her seat of Ipswich in 1996, but only after she'd been booted out of the Liberal Party. She won that as an independent, but was pre-selected as a Liberal. So this would be the first time, but it's not as though the government or anyone sort of is taking them lightly anymore. We had a by-election in the state seat of Nepean in Victoria on the weekend, which the Liberals held onto, albeit with a big swing against them. One Nation got 24%. And that, again, Labor didn't run in that seat. So the best bellwether we've got, Lisa, is the South Australian election.
Yep.
There's a lot of seats in South Australia, as there are in any city, not regional, but just sort of outer suburban seats that are been safe Labor seats for decades. They've had primary votes of 60%. We see similar seats in the far northern suburbs of Melbourne, parts of Sydney, the outreaches of Brisbane, stuff like this. Super safe Labor seats. Now, in the South Australian election, Labor got pushed under 50% in nearly all those seats.
Yeah.
And these are seats where no one votes Liberal. All those swings went straight to One Nation. So what that told the government was that Labor voters in these seats where it's struggle street are prepared to vote for Pauline as well. Now, because they have such strongholds on those seats, they held the seats easily, but there's enough there to show them that they are also exposed. And I think that is what is occupying the mind of Albanese. And when you look at our poll this week, where Labor's vote nationally is at 31, that's almost 4 points lower than they got a year ago.
Yep. That's
the leakage to One Nation in the last year. That is not insignificant.
Sure.
People talk about their 94-seat majority. That'll vanish in a puff of smoke if they get 31 on election day. They'll still win, but they won't be anywhere near 94 seats.
Phil, a final question then. Albanese told you in the interview last week that his approach to government is to focus on where he wants to be in 3 years and work backwards. What does that vision look like, and do you think the government will be able to get there?
I think they'll get there, only because the opposition is just non-existent. I think the next election is really a contest between a majority Labor government and a minority Labor government. I suspect will be the former. But it's just the way he rolls, right? It goes to the sort of pure tactical and strategic nature of this government. They're very, very good at politics. They start with a landing point. What is it we want to tell voters when we call the election in April 2028? What is it we want to have achieved by then? So we can say, this is what we said we do, this is what we've done. He doesn't get caught up in the day-to-day. I mean, you've got to deal with the day-to-day, Lisa. I mean, that's part and part of politics. But as he said in the interview, even when you're responding to the day-to-day, you've got an eye on the longer term. And how's that decision going to be perceived in 18 months' time, not in 18 hours' time? It's tough in politics because the short term, there's so much pressure to respond to the short term all the time. But that's how Albanese's sort of philosophy rolls. They're also, and this is of no surprise, they're not planning their entire election strategy on facing Angus Taylor. You can be confident there's an Andrew Hastie strategy there as well. There may be another change in the Liberal Party next year. 1 year ago, we had an election. This is the first budget since that election. It's the only budget probably in the electoral cycle where the government will be able to do anything that's deemed politically risky, because by this time next year, the next election will be just over a year away and they'll be going back into shutdown mode in terms of not wanting to alienate voters. So as Albanese said when he won his first election in 2022, it's about kicking with the wind in the last quarter.
Thanks, Phil.
Welcome, Liz.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. On the podcast today, political reporter Phillip Coorey. If you want to read more on the federal budget, we've put some links in the show notes. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin. Head of audio is Alex Gow, who also composed our theme, and Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend, as it helps others find us. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. I'm Lisa Murray. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.